Maybe you've heard the old line before. It says, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in your fruit salad. There's something different between knowledge, as in like the memorization of accurate facts, and wisdom that might be more about how you navigate life. Knowledge can be solid and black and white, yes or no. George Washington was the first president of the United States. Columbus is the capital of Ohio. Wisdom, while more important for actually navigating real life situations, is also necessarily a little more slippery, a little more, well, sometimes this is the right thing to do and sometimes that's the right thing to do. We saw that in our most recent Sunday Adult Forum. We've been working our way through the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, all throughout the summer, and we finally arrived at looking at the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. Books like Proverbs, but as well as Job, Ecclesiastes, and the Psalms are sometimes included in this collection as well. Sometimes what's called in the Hebrew Bible the Ketuvim, or the writings. And we saw that there's a variety of different kinds of books of wisdom literature, and much of it isn't even matter-of-fact bullet point, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. Much of it is wrestling with the really big questions in life, like where is God when bad things happen? Or what's the purpose of my life if it's not just getting wealth or pleasure or being the smartest person in the room? What's the meaning of everything when so much of life is fleeting? Those are big, big questions. And yet, there is also a book, we call it the Book of Proverbs, that does often sort of give us pithy, short little rule of thumb kinds of things to do in life. Sometimes the Book of Proverbs is really helpful in giving us memorable little sentences about the importance of hard work, or why you should build your life around fearing God as opposed to wealth, or why you shouldn't chase after easy get-rich-quick schemes, or why it's worth spending your time learning wisdom. In fact, gives us this recurring refrain, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That basically to orient your life around God and an awareness of God's presence puts everything else in a better perspective. That's helpful. There is a lot in the Proverbs that is useful, memorable, and you might trot out to help give you guidance the same way words from your grandfather or your great Aunt Edna come back to you at times when you need it. I can remember my own grandfather's line, measure twice, cut once. That comes back to me when I need it. Or he would always say, do the best you can with what you have where you are. These are good, helpful little nuggets, Proverbs, right, that come back to you when you need them. The thing about Proverbs, whether they're biblical Proverbs or just ordinary cultural knowledge from any time or place, is that they're not meant to be taken as ironclad promises or rules of the universe, and more like rules of thumb, right? That sometimes this applies and sometimes that applies. In our culture, we have examples like we say birds of a feather flock together, which means like people who are like-minded tend to clump together, but we also say opposites attract. Both are true, right? It's a question of when is it time for which piece of wisdom. The book of Proverbs does the same thing, curiously. There will be some times where one proverb points in this direction and another proverb points in a different direction, sometimes even side by side. In Proverbs chapter 26, you get a verse that says, don't answer fools according to their foolishness because you'll just make them mad and they won't listen to you anyway. Others say you should correct a fool because otherwise they'll be wise in their own eyes and presumably make a bunch of stupid mistakes. Right side by side, one right after the other, two completely opposed different counsels, right? Sometimes you should correct somebody because how are they going to learn otherwise? Other times there's no point in trying to correct somebody because you can't unlearn stupid, right? To be rough about it. What's helpful is that the book of Proverbs has compiled these side by side, almost as if to tell us, please don't treat these as if any one of these is an ironclad rule that is true in every time, in every circumstance, no matter what. These are meant to be guides, rules of thumb, guardrails, you might say. Once you know that, then you know how to use this kind of wisdom. And you can understand, too, that just like our cliche about tomatoes and fruit salad, right? You might know for a fact that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom means you don't put it in a fruit salad, but you might put it in a salsa, which is not all that different from a fruit salad, just with slightly different flavors, right? There's a certain sense of, well, it kind of depends. What's the situation that I'm in? Wisdom is all about how do I navigate this situation that I'm in. Proverbs does that one way by giving us short little memorable sentences. But we also looked this last time at the book of Job, which is this really, really long sort of thought experiment that imagines a person who's done nothing wrong suffering terrible losses, the loss of his health and his family and his wealth, and asking the question, does somebody like this still love God? Will somebody still do right even if they don't get anything out of it? And most of the book of Job is sort of a thought experiment between Job and three voices who are cast as his friends, who start all arguing and saying, well, you must have done something wrong, Job, to bring this punishment on you. And Job continually insisting, but that's not true. I didn't do anything to deserve all this. Where's God? I want my vindication. I want my day in court, basically. And the book ends basically saying that Job's friends were wrong, that Job didn't do anything wrong, but not giving us a real clear answer about how to make sense of a world other than God is real, God is there, and the book of Job doesn't give up on the idea that God is good and just, but sometimes we don't get to see that, at least from our perspective. That's a lot messier conclusion than we might want. We would love it to be reduced down to a single sentence, easy to memorize bullet point. And the Bible's honest enough to know life is messier than that. The wisdom literature is a lot more honest in that regard than we often give it credit for. As we'll take a look at in our final session coming up this Sunday, when we take a look at the book of Ecclesiastes and Psalms, we'll see that there's this wide variety of situations in life that we come to God with, right? Our joys as well as our deep laments, our angriest feelings as well as our deepest sense of peace. And that while there's a promise of God being reliable and being there and someone we can always turn to, there's also the acknowledgement sometimes we feel God forsaken and we cry out in prayer about that. Sometimes it feels like you've done your best and your best efforts crumble right in front of you. And that part of the world that we live in. All of those things are lifted up to God in the wisdom literature. So we hope you'll join us for one final session in our summer series, Journey Through the Old Testament, this Sunday, as we take a look at those other books in the writings and the wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible, and maybe get some honest guardrails for how we face day-to-day life, not just with head knowledge, but with wisdom for actually living our lives. Hope to see you then.